News Radio 1040 WHO. Views expressed are those of hosts, guests, and callers, and not necessarily those of News Radio 1040 WHO.
So, no one's taking responsibility for all the opinions on the show? Really? Wow. Well, I'll take responsibility for my own opinion if that's okay. Good morning. This is the Jan Michelson Show. I am not Jan Michelson, as you've already figured out. I'm Mike Dorwart, the new program director here at News Radio 1040 WHO. And this is day 33 for those of you keeping score. 33 days in Iowa now. And I'm happy to be here. We talked a lot yesterday about Iowa Nice, getting to know Iowa, among all of the other topics that we covered. We're going to get right into heavy-duty talk radio this morning, if you will, as we have Kentucky Senator Rand Paul in studio with us. We're going to talk about the caucus and his ambitions to be your president. And I'd like to reserve some time, maybe towards the end of the broadcast, to take some calls from you, the listeners, as well. So if you have a great question for Senator Paul, go ahead and call now at 284-1040, and we'll start lining up and see if we can squeeze at least a couple of calls in before we wrap up at 9:30. Senator Rand Paul, good morning, and welcome once again to WHO.
Good morning, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Happy belated 53rd birthday.
Well, thanks for counting and remembering how ancient I'm becoming.
Hey, welcome to the club. You're showing the signs that all of us are showing at this stage in life, if you will. A little graying at the temples there.
A few gray hairs there, here and there.
So the Des Moines Register did a piece on the quirks of all the candidates, and they painted a rather dour picture of you as a guy who never smiles in photos. And I thought, really, that's all. It was a very short paragraph, but I was like, that's all you got on Rand Paul? He doesn't smile enough?
Yeah, I get this. People come along and they're like, you're not glad-handing enough. You're not hugging and kissing enough babies. And it's like, well, do you also want a president maybe who has the intellectual capacity to examine the problems of the world and figure out what we need to do? But also, I take about 1,000 pictures a day. So I think they're catching me in between smiles.
Well, at least the reporter's noticing it, perhaps. How is campaigning in Iowa different than, well, campaigning in Kentucky?
You know, there's a lot of similarities. We're a farm state. We're a fairly rural state. We have a few cities. You know, you've got Des Moines, a pretty big city. We have Louisville, a pretty big city. Louisville's about a third of our population. So 2/3 of our population is more rural and 1/3 is more urban. But a lot of farming concerns, a lot of small town concerns. And, you know, I grew up in a small town in Texas and now live in a small town in Kentucky. So I'm kind of used to, I think, dealing with people who kind of want to be left alone and don't really see the need for a big government.
So how does a small town guy ultimately end up in Washington, D.C., of all places? Obviously, not looking for your whole history here, but what is it that sparked your ambition? Obviously, you're a bit of a political legacy, but you personally at some point said, man, I want to get into politics.
Well, you know, I practiced medicine for about 20 years. I'm an eye surgeon. I still practice medicine. But I became frustrated and kind of worried about the country. We borrow $1 million a minute. I was actually concerned and upset that Republicans were doubling the debt during the Bush administration. And I was motivated to run primarily because I was upset Republicans were spending like no tomorrow. Republicans were increasing the Department of Education when once upon a time Republicans believed in actually eliminating the Department of Education. I was upset that Republicans were bailing out the big banks at the expense of, I think, the middle class and the regular folks. And now I'm even more upset. The Democrats have doubled the debt from $10 trillion to $20 trillion. And I'm concerned that it could really affect the republic at its very foundation.
Yesterday on this show, talked a lot about China's little overnight issues with their stock markets. And I guess it was my opinion that, you know, when China's having economic issues, that actually might be kind of good for us as Americans because they just don't then have the financial wherewithal to keep building up their military. You may not share that opinion, but obviously China owns a ton of our debt, right? Of that 18 to $20 trillion. I just have a picture of a bunch of it just sitting in a bank account in China somewhere.
I think China has about $1 trillion worth of our debt. Japan's got about $1 trillion worth of our debt. And one of the things I often say tragically and tragicomically is that we even owe Mexico money. We owe Mexico $100 million. We owe Russia money. We owe everybody money. Once upon a time, we were a great exporter nation. Now the number one export we have is our debt. And that is worrisome. And you can't continue to be a great country if you become further and further mired in debt.
National security has become a big part of this campaign, obviously since the terrorism and ISIS attacks, both abroad and here in the U.S. And, of course, yesterday's news cycle was all driven by the possibility that there was a nuclear test in North Korea. Was it atomic? Was it nuclear? And I guess just my own opinion, and I ask yours, is, do we really worry that much about North Korea? Beyond the headlines and whatever entertainment value may come out of it, and all the list of things to worry about, are they even in the top 7?
I think the most worrisome thing about North Korea pursuing advanced nuclear weapons is that there seems to be emotional, if not mental, instability in the leadership in North Korea. And so it's not as if we're dealing with rational actors that understand maybe the destructive force of having a nuclear war. The things that we have going for us, though, with regard to North Korea is they're completely inept. They have an economy that is one of the worst in the world. They can barely feed their own people. But we do need to think about policy. Bill Clinton, when he was president, gave them $4 billion in foreign aid in exchange for a promise not to develop nuclear weapons.
Didn't George Bush do the same thing?
Yeah, I've been opposed to it. I think you can't necessarily buy friendship. I also don't think that people who will take the money or end up being your friends, I think they're end up treating us deceitfully or dishonestly. But I wouldn't feed the North Koreans. In fact, I would encourage the Chinese not to feed the North Koreans. And while I'm not for us imposing regime change, I think if you don't feed them, they might decide that they would like a different government.
Okay. Leadership in the Republican Party has been a real source of frustration for a lot of rank-and-file people out here. I mean, you look at what happened in elections in 2010, 2012, 2014. The rank-and-file saying, man, we want to stay tough. We want to stand up to the things that don't make sense from our point of view, and yet the leadership continues to make a lot of deals. And I know that that's, with Paul Ryan now as Speaker of the House, and it's just, the issue of leadership in the party has just been so frustrating to Republicans. As president, how do you influence that leadership? Because obviously you're no longer part of the elective body electing those leaders. You're working from the executive office.
This has been a big part of my frustration in the U.S. Senate is that we're supposed to have the power of the purse. It's supposed to be a very, very important power that is supposed to be a check and a balance on the presidential power. But we really haven't used the power of the purse. I mean, I think we've abdicated our responsibility, and we've had weak leadership within Congress because we give up so much to the president.
Would you include Mitch McConnell in that?
I'd include all leadership, really, because I think that raising the debt ceiling was a mistake. But it's interesting to see where this comes from. It's not just Democrats wanting to spend money. It's actually Republicans wanting to spend money. It's just for different reasons. Both sides have their sacred cows. Republicans say, we've got to increase military spending. People like Rubio want to do it without limit. And I think that's equally dangerous to those on the left who want to increase welfare spending or domestic spending. But really what happens in Washington is if you want more military spending, you've got to give the left more welfare spending. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Everybody gets more spending, but then the taxpayer gets stuck with the bill. So I've probably been one of the loudest, if not the loudest voice in Washington saying, enough's enough. We cannot keep spending ourselves into oblivion. Someone has to stand up and say, I'm not voting for 2,242-page bills that no one can read, that are cobbled together in the dead of night, and that perpetuate a system that borrows $1 million a minute.
Which is exactly what happened just a few weeks ago. Let me take a quick question on the question of leadership. John, welcome to the Jan Michelson Show with a quick question, please, for Senator Rand Paul.
Yeah, you just talked about leadership. You backed Mitch McConnell for Senate.
Hold on just a second. We need to, I didn't realize he didn't have headphones on, so he couldn't hear you. That is completely my fault. I apologize, Senator. All right, go ahead, John. Ask your question.
You talk about leadership. You backed Mitch McConnell to be for senator. There was a guy running against him by the name of Matt Bevin, and he's now your current governor. You kept the problem going. We had a chance to get rid of leadership, and you backed him.
All right. Thank you for the question, John.
Actually, I think what you'd find if you examine my record that there's been no greater opponent in the Senate of leadership than myself. I stood for 10 and a half hours opposing the leadership on the NSA and saying that they shouldn't spy on us and collect our records. I stood for 13 and a half hours opposing both Republicans and Democrats who said that, you know what, we might someday use drones on American citizens. I've stood in the well of the Senate and spoken for hours and hours and never been fearful of leadership on either side. In fact, the interesting thing is over the fall, when we had the debate over raising the debt ceiling, I lectured them from 2 in the morning till 3 in the morning, and I can promise you there were quite a few senators red in the face and swearing under their breath at me because they weren't happy to be there in the morning. But I am the one senator who actually has had the courage to stand up, not only to vote against the spending, but to speak out against it, and really to honestly admit that the spending problem in Washington is both Republican and Democrat.
All right, I am in studio here with Senator Rand Paul running for president. First, of course, the GOP nomination. This is Mike Dorwart in for Jan Michelson. We're going to continue with more conversation with Rand Paul in just a moment. This is News Radio 1040 WHO.